and then I'll get us started. All right, I am recording, so let me cue this back up here. Can you see that, Jake? We good? All right, very good. Well, welcome all to the Royal Rumble between ChatGPT and Kristian's templates. So what I've done is this. I asked 5 students to basically write against the ChatGPT using my templates. So there's going to be a good portion of tonight where I have to teach people my templates, because some of you I'm very familiar with. I've seen you around the National Writing Project, and you've done some of my webinars and subscribed to my YouTube channel and all of that good stuff. But in looking in the peanut gallery here, there's a number of you I think are new to me. So I'll spend a little time debriefing and kind of giving a cursory overview of the templates, and then we'll take a deep dive into what this ChatGPT is doing and what my students are doing to trump that ChatGPT. So just a little bit of background information on me. I'm that guy who's always asking, what if we taught composition like Bob Ross teaches painting? So that's kind of my inquisitive question. And I think it changes everything. So there's a fundamental difference between the assigning of teaching and the direct explicit teaching of it. So I always tell teachers when I work with them through the National Writing Project, or if I'm just doing PD on my own, to embrace your inner Bob Ross and to get to the proverbial easel and canvas and paint with your students. And the thing about Bob Ross is this: a lot of people don't know this about him. He used something called a heuristic, which is basically the exact same thing as a template. And it's called the wet on wet technique. So every single time he did a painting on Joy of Painting, he employed the wet on wet technique. And with my templates, every time I do an expository essay with students, I either declare or invert my thesis, and I tackle the body paragraph syllogistically. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I mean by Bob Rossing, like using templates, using the modeling approach, etc. So as I said, I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. And as I present tonight, I'll weave in some of the programs and things that I'm doing with them and some projects that I have going on. And for those that are new to me, I'm housed in Rochester, New York. And I have a nice little cottage on the lake, and that's why I have this really old fisherman cottage, and that's why the lighting is so dark in my house. I have like all these lights surrounded around me, so hopefully I don't look too angelic in it. And love to paddleboard, love cats, big active runner, and do all that kind of stuff. So my background, I did my graduate work at Brown, kind of a Ted Sizer disciple, and very familiar with School Without Walls and School of the Arts, and my background's in composition and rhetoric. And I've been teaching for 21 years now, and love it, love every day of it. And I'm really eager to share what I know with regards to all this stuff tonight. So in terms of our collective concerns, I'm very, very active in the Facebook groups and on Instagram and LinkedIn. And ever since this ChatGPT came out a couple of weeks ago, one of the major concerns has been, how are we going to determine what's an authentic demonstration of knowing, right? If we're assigning essays, how are we to know that it truly is authentically a student, produced essay, or something coming from an artificial intelligence source? And I'm going to show you tonight that if you equip kids with templates, whether they be mine or anyone else's templates, there's plenty of other people in the YouTube world that are using templates. So whether they be mine or one of those people in the YouTube channels, you can really, ascertain whether or not a student is using, one of these cheat hacks or not. The other thing too, with the advent of all this new technology, students are finding incredible loopholes to cheat. And I think it's a very pervasive problem in our classrooms. So I teach AP Language and AP Lit, and AP Classroom is just a breeding ground for cheating. And I don't really use it all that much because of that. All of our kids in my district have Google Chromebooks. And ever since that happened about 8 years ago, the cheating has become rampant. And then we decided to buy new programs like eDoctrina, and that's just become a breeding ground for cheating, etc. Like the technology just breeds cheating. So we have this existential acknowledgement of our classroom lives. Like, where do we stand now as composition instructors, as ELA instructors, with all of these nefarious things at our kids' disposal? And I'm here to say, by the end of this evening, we'll be able to identify when a student is cheating pretty cut and clear, because I've studied the ChatGPT's nuance and his subtleties very carefully, and I kind of got a good sense of his mannerisms as a writer. And I'll unpack some of that with you tonight. So if you want, you can place your comments, your thoughts, your reflections, your questions in the chat. My good friend from Brown University, Jake Rashkind, is our moderator. We spoke last night, and I was very happy that he volunteered, because usually my daughter, I pay her a little bit to be the moderator, but she's working on her college applications very last minute last night, so she can't be here. So we'll have natural transition breaks, and Jake knows he can unmute himself and cut me off at any time if there's some urgent question that needs to be addressed. And then I just ask that you limit distractions and keep yourself muted unless you're given the okay to unmute yourself. So let's dive right in. So I sent everyone an email or a direct message and said that we're going to focus on rhetorical analysis and literary analysis. And my students in AP Lang are working on a Frederick Douglass passage, so we'll take a look at the work they did for Frederick Douglass. My on-level juniors are doing a literary analysis of song lyrics, and I got a lot of Swifties in my in my 11R class. So the examples that I pulled, just for consistency and simplicity's sake, are from Taylor Swift's song Anti-Hero. They did a literary analysis of that. And my AP Lit kids are taking a look at Sonnet 130 from Shakespeare. So those are the pieces that we're going to be focusing on. So I'm going to start with rhetorical analysis, and the title of the piece is "What to the American Slave is Your 4th of July?" So I did a very interesting exercise with my students today, as a matter of fact, and it totally changed the direction of my presentation. Some of you might know me for my wackadoodle alternative grading methods. I don't traditionally grade all that often. I've invented a lot of alternative grading methods. I think one of the most futile things we do is the traditional grading paradigm. And I cobbled something together where I really wanted to see if my students could identify ChatGPT writing versus their own writing done under the auspices of my template. So in this alternative grading method, I ran it like this. So let me go to this slide. I chose papers that the kids wrote, that my students wrote, and I didn't put any comments on them or anything whatsoever. I just slapped a number down on my notepad, and I wanted to pull a couple of introductions, just the introductory paragraphs, really focusing on thesis and ensuring that you got the sophistication point. You're leaning towards the sophistication point out of the gate. So I pulled a couple of hundreds, papers that I thought were headed towards 100, out of the gate, headed towards 90, 80, and then I and the ChatGPT did the 70s, 60s, and 50s. And just as one little caveat here, as the ChatGPT progresses in its exemplars and models, he's going to get craftier. So what I did was I pretended to be like the epitome of the laziest kid that I have using ChatGPT, to the kid that really wants to finagle the ChatGPT and make it sound like himself or herself. So the initial samples or models are going to be kind of lackluster, and then I'm going to pour it on with ChatGPT and then show you what my students are doing. So here's what we did. Based on each relevant attribute of the template and rubric, compare the ChatGPT's essay to the class sample submitted. So I established this coin-based award system based on my templates and rubrics. And I did a lot of Bob Rossing for my students on how to write this essay. So across the, I'm going the wrong directions, across the room on desk, I just made little stations where I laid down introductions. And my students had these coins. I just laminated them, cut them out in little circles and laminated them. And next to the introduction that they read, they needed to write down, where did they think the grade was headed? All right. Great way to really get students to take a look at a lot of writing. The first question we have to ask ourselves is this: how do you construct an introductory paragraph, especially for rhetorical analysis? And I tell my students that you have two options. You can declare or invert. But here's the kicker. For rhetorical analysis, I tell my guys to always declare, and for literary analysis to invert. And I'll show both of those tonight, but I'm going to start with rhetorical analysis. Here's a little cheat. This is a little hack. So our ChatGPT cheats. Kristian Kuhn likes to cheat exams too a little bit. There are tendencies in prompts, and I'm speaking specifically about the FRQs on the AP Lang exam. And this is true of the AP Lit FRQ1 and FRQ2. Implicit in those prompts are two questions. What is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? If students get to the gist of both of those questions in the space of an introductory paragraph, they should absolutely get the thesis point. All right, it comes down to correctly reading the work, though. They have to ascertain a correct meaning. Excuse me, been nursing a cold. For the purposes of rhetorical analysis, what students are going to do is focus on the construction of meaning heavily. So I want them to take like 3 sentences to answer that question. How does the author construct meaning? 1 sentence authorial intent. In literary analysis, you flip that. So you do 3 sentences authorial intent, 1 sentence construction of meaning. When you answer construction of meaning, that's your thesis. So let me break that down. You're going to need to see that. So in my classroom, I have a poster that looks like this. And it's all the rhetorical terms, devices, techniques that we've seen so far this year. And this is just a quick list that I generated for the purposes of tonight. And I know I got enumeration and anaphora down there twice. I apologize about that. But this is what my students have seen in just doing rhetorical analysis now for about 3.5 weeks, because we started with argument, synthesis, persuasion, and research. So we're about 3.5 weeks into it. What I have my students do when they're answering the question, how does the author construct meaning? I have them focus on 3 of the most salient moves that the author makes. So find the 3 most salient, germane, relevant terms that the author uses to construct meaning. Now, when you're declaring, you begin with the thesis, right? So begin with construction of meaning. You're going to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background for that. Really focus on the construction of meaning, and then 1 sentence authorial intent. Now, you're going to see some stuff that I don't have all that much time to get into tonight. My students go through an intensive word study academy with me. I do intense vocab study with my guys. And it's a staple of what I do at the National Writing Project too. So I call it tier 2 level vocabulary. And all I mean by that is get into like SAT level caliber words is what I mean by tier 2. So you're going to see my students flex their vocab quite a bit. They're dealing with a Frederick Douglass speech, which is really serious stuff. So I told them you probably want to hold off on using too much colloquial or vernacular in it. So you're going to kind of geek out on this a little bit. I also send my students through something called the Nuance Academy. And in the Nuance Academy, we studied these dudes, Strunk and White. They wrote a book called Write It Right and the Elements of Style. In Write It Right, they have something called rule number 18. And they assert that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence. So there's 12 sentence constructs. My students are super well versed on that. So in order to achieve voice rhythm and flow and get that elusive sophistication point, you're going to see my students make some pretty crafty syntactical manipulations in this. And then if they're sticking to the template, it's going to be 4 sentences long. All right, always 4 sentences long for the intro. So let's take a look at a few and give you a sense of what we got here. Here's a slide that I want to show you though. There's a seismic difference between rhetorical analysis and plot analysis. And guess what, my friends? ChatGPT don't know the difference. ChatGPT writes a lot of plot analysis. My students are skilled and drilled in the art of writing rhetorical analysis. All right, my templates ensure that they do rhetorical analysis from start to finish. It's the demand of the assignment. And I've spent a lot of time reading College Board sample papers. And unfortunately, a lot of kids in the nation do write plot analysis, and they still fare okay. But my kids are cutthroat and are going rhetorical analysis and literary analysis from start to finish. I'm kind of a stickler on that. So let's take a look at an example here. So again, we're going to go 3 + 1, 3 sentences, construction of meaning, 1 sentence, authorial intent. So this is my student writing, okay? Throughout its entirety, Douglas's speech completely obliterates any white claims to universal American independence through its perfectly crafted language and sentence structure, which work hand in hand to reveal the utter horror and barbarity of slavery in the United States. His extremely long sentences, which slowly break down the reader's stamina, perfectly reflect the never-ending mistreatment and suffering of slaves. As a former slave, this puts him in a position to humble his white audience. Endless comparisons of white jubilation to black outrage and disbelief serve to bring out the irony of their celebration, helping listeners realize the great hypocrisy of their ways. By the end of all this hammering, the opposing side can only crumble under the weight of his accusations and recognize the need for slavery to end. Now, what you have going on in here is that there's a solid concentration on 3 devices, terms, techniques that construct the meaning, okay? So I tell my students, you always got to do syntax, tone, and diction. You pretty much got to, focus on ethos, pathos, logos. My students will be implying the terms instead of forthrightly saying them. At least that's how I teach them. I want them to imply as long as it's clear. And that's how they're going to do it every single time. 3 + 1. So you see they got to focus on syntax, heavy focus on the logos, and then kind of implicit, the ethos and the tone is in here as well. And then just 1 sentence, authorial intent. Like, what's his theme? What's the exigence of the piece? Why did he write it? What's his universal truth in doing that? So this is one example, one really good example of how my students execute. And today during our writing workshop, most kids laid down 100 coin next to this one. This was the best one out of the entire class. That was exceptional. Note the sentence constructs though. Did you hear when I read that? It flows very well. All right, here's observation number 1 from ChatGPT. ChatGPT loves the independent clause. I'm going to say that again. ChatGPT loves the independent clause. So my students in studying the ChatGPT said, geez, Mr. Kuhn, it looks like he only knows like 3 of the 12 sentence constructs. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. He uses short, simple declarative sentences, the adverb clause, the adjective clause, and the independent clause. And that's pretty much exclusively it. In order to get him to break that sentence pattern, the student is going to have to fix the syntactical arrangements. So, and that's like hours of spending with the ChatGPT. And we'll take a look at some of his writing in just a second. And then, a real good cheating student can fix that. So here's another one, again, using that 3 + 1 system. Emphasizing the dichotomy between racial groups in America, Douglas gives a harsh rebuttal of America's supposed freedom. Through a series of well-placed rhetorical questions, Douglas separates the American slave from the white man, exposing the irony of the 4th of July celebrations. His use of isolating pronouns such as your and us further widen the gap, hammering home his point that America still doesn't experience widespread equality. By exposing the irony and atrocities of life for the American slave, Douglas expresses the idea that America is an evil with no rival past or present. I'm going to go back a couple of slides here to this. There's a seismic difference between rhetorical analysis and plot analysis. The two examples that you've looked at unequivocally are rhetorical analysis. Go to this one that we just looked at. Do you hear all the focus like on rhetorical questions, isolating pronouns? ChatGPT will not do that unless you prompt it to. And when you prompt it to, it often will quote. It quotes. And in my template, I don't have any quotes in my introduction. I don't want the kids paraphrasing. I don't want them summarizing. I don't want anything to sound like a Cliff Note summation whatsoever. Hardcore rhetorical analysis thesis, nuts and bolts. That's it. So my class said this one was like a solid 100 as well. Look at what, and this was the first time I ever experimented with ChatGPT. ChatGPT. You have to feed it a line. You have to give it like a starter sentence. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to be, one of Mr. Kuhn's disciplined students and just give it the first line and see where it goes. So this is mine. I wrote this first sentence. By highlighting the racial dichotomy that exists in the United States, Douglas offers a scathing rebuke of what independence means for Black America. And then boom, quote dump. Every single time that ChatGPT is fed a first sentence like that, like 9 out of 10 times it's going to grab a quote, and it'll just drop the quote for you. I would immediately identify that if a student were to do that, because since September 7th, I got my kids the day after Labor Day. Since September 7th, we've said, do not quote in your introductions. No paraphrasing, no quoting, no summarizing, none of that stuff. So here we are. What is it? Today's January 12th. I'd lose my ever-loving mind if a student were to do this after me Bob Rossing my instruction all year thus far. I would lose it. So you can't do that. So here's the thing. I've caught my kids using ChatGPT already. Right? I've caught 3 kids doing it, and I'm going to show you their work in just a second. So for this very assignment, I caught kids cheating. So here's another one that steps down from the 100. My students gave this one a 90. Look how it goes though, and just look at the subtle variation. Like anyone who's livid and straight up frustrated at the thought of unfair treatment, Frederick Douglass highlights factors that do not, in fact, contribute to one of the many titles of the United States, Land of the Free. Using rhetorical questions, Douglass seems to bring up that this holiday isn't extended to them, who've been oppressed for as long as they have been in this free country. The reoccurring usage of the pronouns I and your in Douglass's speech build credibility in his words, creating a bridge of ethos and pathos as he tries to relate himself, a former slave, to his people. The stylistic syntax with the run-on also enlarges the small problems that, I got to move my slide here, that African Americans face into a giant umbrella of continuing issues. So there's just some control issues here. There's some voice control issues that, a couple of little small blunders that drop it a little off from the 100. Like the explicit use of ethos and pathos, I'm not a big fan of. That first sentence, who is livid and straight up frustrated, kind of little language glitches like that in this. ChatGPT will not do that. ChatGPT is silky smooth and it's very robotic cadence. It does not have awkward wording. So do you know, as composition teachers, we often come upon students who try to go out of their wheelhouse and use words that they don't know? ChatGPT does not do that. ChatGPT knows every word. So I caught one of my students cheating because he is of the impression that the more $1 million words you use, the better the writing. And I haven't been able to disabuse him of that. And I'm reading his essay and I'm like, geez, where's all the weird wording? Like, where's the like, I don't know, he loves using words like cornucopia and plethora. There's a plethora of tone. So there's a cornucopia of diction. You know how kids do weird things like that in their writing? ChatGPT does not do that. It does not do that. So ChatGPT does not do a good job of using the rhetorical terms at all. I'm not sure if ChatGPT even knows the rhetorical terms. So that was an interesting find. So let me show you one that that I did for ChatGPT, like a whole introduction. So when you type in this speech and say, write me paper, write me essay, this is what I got for an introduction. Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist writer and orator who was born into slavery in Maryland in the early 19th century. Notice my template doesn't give any background information on the author. You get right into the analysis. So I would immediately flag that. Also, my students have been told to write present tense, always write in the present tense. ChatGPT's proclivity, it always writes past tense. You have to tell it to write present tense. It always writes in the past tense if the text is dated. He escaped to freedom in the North in 1838 and became a leading figure in the abolitionist movement, using his powerful voice in writing to condemn the institution of slavery and advocate for the rights of African Americans. In his famous speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, which he delivered on July 5th. So do you notice my students don't give any of this information? I'm like, guys, I wrote the prompt. You don't need to do that. Like the College Board wrote the prompt. You got, readers are reading thousands of essays that they know. You don't need to tell them that stuff. So all of my kids omit this stuff. ChatGPT includes it systematically. So, and in playing with this for hour after hour, this is the caliber of writing that I would get from ChatGPT. Lots of summation, lots of summation. So, all right, I want to play a little game with you guys. ChatGPT versus Kristian's templates, audience participation. Do you guys remember Abbott and Costello, Who Done It? We're going to play the game Who Done It. Who done these introductions? Kristian's kids or ChatGPT? So here's the first one. In his speech, Frederick Douglass conveys his disgust with the hypocrisy of what the 4th of July has come to symbolize for him and his fellow Black Americans. Yes, Frederick Douglass delivered a famous speech on July 4th, 1852, in which he spoke about the 4th of July and the celebration of Independence Day in the United States. In the speech titled, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, Douglass criticized the hypocrisy of celebrating the 4th of July, while the institution of slavery and racial inequality persisted in the United States. He argued that the celebration of Independence Day was meaningless to Black Americans who were denied the same freedoms and rights as white Americans. Douglass used the occasion of the 4th of July to call for the end of slavery and the achievement of true freedom and equality for all people, regardless of their race. Go ahead, fire up the chat real quick. What do you guys think? Jake, can you monitor this one? See what people put?
Yes, I can try to do that. And you're getting mostly people saying GPT.
Yeah.
That is what you're getting, but you also had one question I think is where someone office said, but isn't that info explaining occasion? Shouldn't that be in the intro?
I was coughing just now. Sorry.
Before that, I mean, I think everybody's universally recognized it as ChatGPT. And the stray comment was the first one, but isn't that info explaining occasion and shouldn't that be in the intro?
For exam purposes, I have my students do it when they're taking the actual exam. But for like for example, I teach at Nazareth College and MCC, Monroe Community College. At the college level, we don't do that. In fact, it drives my colleagues nuts when we do that. So, our students for AP Lang are supposed to read, write, think, and speak like college sophomore English majors. So I do it very differently than what a lot of College Board instructors suggest and teach. And they're fine. They're still going to get the thesis point. And I think when students do that explicit move, it actually precludes them from getting the sophistication point. I'm going to do a webinar on that in a couple of months, actually, with National Writing Project, how to get the elusive sophistication point. There's a lot of what we tell students to do that actually hurts them. And I think that's one thing that hurts them. It's very artificial.
One other point was made by Lynette, who did bring up that it is it's written here, but it is 4 sentences. So I think making the point that if you're teaching your kids that might be
Yep. It's absolutely, the chat wrote this one. It's devoid of any rhetorical analysis. There's no rhetorical thesis for this. It's very thematic focused and summative. It basically summarizes the speech. And I know a lot of AP Lang teachers instruct their students to do this. I'm a different breed. I'm a totally different animal when it comes to introductions and approaching rhetoric. So I'm old school in the sense that, you know, I was raised in the that sounds like I'm super old. I was taught in the Aristotelian tradition, and my templates are rooted in that Aristotelian tradition of doing just straight up nuts and bolts rhetorical analysis. And you don't want any of that Cliff Note-esque quality in an introduction. It really just doesn't have a place there. So let's do this one. Who done it? Frederick Douglass, a well-educated abolitionist, writes a scathing critique of the American tradition of celebrating the 4th of July. The language he employs emphasizes the irony present in the way Americans celebrate the holiday, drawing attention to it with his barrage of rhetorical questions. His enumeration of all the ways he feels insulted by the holiday highlight how deeply insulting the whole occasion is. Frederick Douglass sees the 4th of July as one thing, a sham celebration for hypocrites and their hypocritical government alike. All right, hit the chat on that one. You're muted, Jake.
I'm seeing here, Coon Kid, student, student.
Yep. Do you see this? Naming things, enumeration, employs emphasis. He emphasizes the irony. I'm telling you guys, to get the ChatGPT to do this, it actually takes longer to get the chat to do this, to produce this, than to just write it yourself. You know, and for real, and my students and I had a very candid conversation about being ethical today during our writing workshop. And they, you know, I asked the library and our media center to, because we blocked all ChatGPTs in our school. The kids have no access to them at all. And I said, just unblock it, because I'm doing an experiment with it. And the kids said, you know, I can write better. And I was like, yes, amen. I can die a happy man. Yes, I needed to hear that. You can write better. You don't need to cheat, right? So giving them a template actually disincentivizes the cheating quite a bit. So, all right, for time's sake, I'm gonna speed us up. I had others there. But,
I did want to mention, just because there so 2 questions. One person, Marianne is asking, how do I make this sample big enough to see? So I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know either. I don't know.
It's pretty big on my computer. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. If you're using a phone, maybe get on a computer. Not sure. I can't make my screen any bigger. So for time, go ahead. Yeah,
because Kelly pointed out something that I think is also important. Made the comment that in that one sentence, there's the repetition of insulted and insulting. So it's, you know, something that could be more polished. So it highlights that a student probably did do that. And
yeah,
which is, you know, interesting too, because I think you're talking about something very specific in terms of recognizing a trend. It's also, I mean, maybe for a larger discussion later, but the question of how do we, if we think something's too good, you know, the benefit of being able to connect the academic dishonesty to an actual work that you find, there's certainly some challenges posed by GPT because it's, always a new thing.
Yep, yep, yep. And we know too, the nefarious little thing is going to improve its devious ways. And it's early, man. I mean, it's in its infancy. So we'll have to see how it evolves and morphs and kind of what direction it's going to take. So it's kind of perfect timing. I timed that perfectly because I wanted to do half rhetorical analysis, half literary analysis. Let's see what my on-level juniors are doing with Taylor Swift's Anti-Hero. So we're still going to focus on introductions. And again, just to emphasize the fact that to get my students to write like this, I'm at the easel and the proverbial canvas all the time writing with them. I'm a firm believer in this. If teacher positions himself, herself as expert writer in the classroom and paints with the kid a lot, and they see a lot of good writing, holy cow, are you going to have a classroom of flourishing, growing, maturing writers on your hands. So it's really cool. We dug into our portfolios the other day because I saw a lot of chins kind of going down like, I'm no good. They got Eeyore. And I was like, oh, come on, read the essay you wrote the second week of September and compare it to what you just wrote this week. And they were laughing at themselves like, holy cow, it was that bad. I'm like, you were that bad. And that's how much you've grown. So it takes work. You got to really practice it. So question, how do I write the introduction? Declare or invert, but we're doing literary analysis. So we're going to invert. We have the same two questions. What is the authorial intent and how does the author construct meaning? Here's the shebang with this. This time we're going to take 3 sentences authorial intent, 1 sentence construction of meaning. It's just the opposite of rhetorical analysis. So still doing 3 plus 1, we just flipped it. So 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. Construction of meaning is always the thesis. It's going last, so it's inverted. So we just flip it over. So the last time you saw this, we began with the thesis. We end with the thesis. So 3 sentences, authorial intent, you funneling down, boom, construction of meaning, last sentence. Same stuff, going to focus on those tier 2s, sentence constructs, 4 sentences. Note though, we're dealing with a different caliber of literature here. We're dealing with a Taylor Swift lyric, not a Frederick Douglass speech. So I have my students really pay attention to what they're analyzing, and it dictates to what extent you can use the colloquial and the vernacular. I don't want my students sounding pedantic or overly contrived. I do think that in order to get the sophistication point, and even though these guys they're 11th grade Regent students, they're not AP students. So I still talk about sophistication with them. I still talk about voice, rhythm, and flow. The pizzazz, the wow, the spunkiness, the flair. In order to do that, you really got to teeter-totter that tier 2, the colloquial and the vernacular. It's a very delicate balance. So let's see what this looks like. I got this big screen here. Hold on, you guys keep popping onto my text here, your pictures. Let me move you. Hold on. So 3 plus 1. So we're going to start with like universal truth, some teachers call it, universal theme, exigence, the author's thesis. So look at this. Self-understanding does come about without a great deal of introspection. But for most people, especially when their reflections find fault with their core essence, they seek to change and become a better person. An anti-hero, on the other hand, persists in the narcissistic carnage their actions garner, regardless of the outcome or impact. And then, so that we're 3 into authorial intent. Look at the last sentence. Construction of meaning. You got to use your terms and your devices. And I tell my students, probably focus on 2, sometimes 3, like the most salient one. So look at this. Taylor Swift touches upon this fact through honest self-deprecation and a series of parentheticals, right? So you drop your terms and your devices there. So the characterization and some of the syntactical maneuvers that she makes, the students making the claim that those are the 2 most important things. So if we do it again, we take a look at student number 2, it's going to be 3 plus 1, 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. Our self-image, as it gets constructed by our internal monologue, essentially determines what we become. It's the law of attraction at play. If one thinks self-destructive thoughts, their world will get painted with the according color palette. And the opposite can be said of happy self-thoughts. So here we are at the end. Taylor Swift touches upon just how anti-heroic it is to ignore the voice of better reason through a series of paradoxes and syntactical maneuvers. So my students do this every time they write literary analysis. So here we are, January 12th. I still Bob Ross quite a bit for my on-level classes, but for my AP kids, I ain't Bob Ross in that much anymore. They got this. They systematically know what to do. And I was doing a PD with a district in the Pittsburgh area the other day, and working with a teacher with seniors, and she gave the assignment, and the kids just sat there looking at her like, what do I do? And I'm like, they don't know what to do. They're seniors. They've been writing essays their whole lives. And she was like, that's the thing, Kristian, they don't know what to do. You give a kid a template, they will systematically know what to do. It totally demystifies the writing process. And I know that there are some pedagogues that are like, oh, templates are paint by numbers. Dude, these kids aren't painting by numbers. They're just following a logical sequence, right? These are their own words. It's their own sentence constructs. They've gone through my Word Study Academy. They've gone through my Nuance Academy. They all got some pretty good voice rhythm flow going on. You know, I think out of the gate, these are just Regents kids. If I were to put them in my AP Lit class, I think any AP reader would read this and say, wow, if this kid can sustain this for the duration of the paper, I'm definitely giving this kid the sophistication point. I teach my AP kids the same way. I teach my college kids the same way. When I'm teaching adults through the National Writing Project, same way. One template every single time. So here's student number 3. Typically, honest self-understanding liberates one from repeating painful histories over and over again. In many regards, one expects a hero to learn from their mistakes in order to conquer the next obstacle life throws at them. An anti-hero, conversely, stubbornly persists in spite of being a wrecking ball in virtually everyone else's life. Third or fourth sentence, terms, devices, techniques. Taylor Swift touches upon this irony through her protagonist ruminating self-dialogue and syntactical manipulations. So every time it's just 3 + 1, very easy peasy. So what about our friends, our ChatGPT guys? What's going on? So let's do this again. Can you spot the difference? I'm going to show you some that the chat did. And this was me working the chat for probably about 10 minutes to get it to write this. Here's something that I found with ChatGPT. The newer the text, the less it has. So that might be an incentive for some of you to do more contemporary work, because there was so much on Shakespeare. I mean, ChatGPT had an arsenal on Shakespeare, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. It had very little on Taylor Swift that didn't read like a cliff note or something. So this is what ChatGPT wrote as an introduction for this song. Taylor Swift is a popular singer and songwriter who has released many hit songs over the years. Some of the themes that she's addressed in her music, like Anti-Hero, include love, heartbreak, self-discovery, and personal growth. Swift is known for writing deeply personal and emotional lyrics that often draw from her own experiences and relationships, as she does in this song. She often explores the ups and downs of love and the complexities of human emotions, and her music often resonates with listeners who can relate to the experiences she sings about. Swift has also used her platform and influence to speak out on social and political issues, and she's been praised for using her music to inspire and empower her fans. Anti-Hero is no exception. Like, I would immediately spot this. So, you know, one, it kind of gives a cursory overview of Taylor Swift's entire catalog. And I love that ChatGPT did this, parentheses, like, quotation, anti-hero, parentheses. It's like it forgot what it was talking about. And then, you know, if you're familiar with the song Anti-Hero, it's not a song about love. It's not a song about heartbreak. It is kind of about self-discovery and personal growth. So ChatGPT actually did a misread of the song, right? So love and the complexity of human emotions, it's not about that. So the Chat GPT actually did a misread. So I don't know if the College Board were to make an FRQ2 based around anti-hero, how they would score this, because I don't even really think it has a thesis, because there's such that big read in there. What do you guys say about that? Throw some things in the chat about this one. I don't know if Jake is with us or not. He went black. You with us, Jake?
Yeah, I'm with you. I just didn't mute and put the video on. Yes, I did want to mention there was a question from Kathy K that's related, but it's a little back to the Chat GTP. It says, how does Chat GPT seem to do with transitions? Does the artificially generated stuff seem more choppy or flowy?
Yep, transitions are very brusque, very abrupt. So I think I have some. Yeah, I didn't do body paragraphs tonight, just for time's sake. But if you want to experiment on your own and kind of play with it, the Chat GPT struggles immensely with quote transitions, getting into and out of quotes. And I have a template within the template for my syllogistic body paragraph. It's called the 5-word rule. So it's this in brief. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of a quote and keeps the quote small, it should sound conversational. But one of the things my students do a lot to keep it conversational is use brackets. ChatGPT does not know how to bracket a quote, so it doesn't sound conversational at all. So, does that make sense? I hope I answered that question. So the quote transitions are not smooth. Transitions into and out of quotes are not good. ChatGPT does a lot of throw the period down, bring the dump truck, dump the quote, which is something I go bananas. I go berserk when my students do that. I've really re-hardwired their brains not to do that type of stuff. And the ChatGPT does it almost systematically when it quotes.
I think the consensus from the comments here from Kristian said, I don't see an argument. Rebecca said it reads like a Wikipedia page. So I think there's a general consensus from what I'm gathering from the comments, for those who have commented, that this reads more informational than any kind of argument.
Yep. Now, here's the kicker. All right. And I know that some of you in here, you follow some of the other YouTubers that present, and they have their YouTube followings. I'm going to say something that I will stand by till I die. I am utterly convicted of this. You got to teach literary theory, especially at the AP level. And the College Board, even though they won't admit it, they have a proclivity. They have a preference for new criticism and deconstruction, especially on the AP literature exam. They prefer kids who can read and write with a new critical and deconstructive lens. All right, same for AP language. I teach my kids new criticism and deconstruction. It's very important to do for rhetorical analysis. Here's the thing. ChatGPT does not know how to do new criticism and deconstruction. It only knows how to write reader response theory and post-colonial historical reads. I'm wondering if anyone wants to chat that up in the chat box. So my templates and the way I teach, my kids are doing new criticism and deconstruction. ChatGPT cannot do it. I tried for hours to try to get it to do new critical and deconstructive reads. It can't do it. It does reader response and historical reads, like post-colonial reads. Anyone want to chime in on that? I can show you two real quick. Jake, is there anyone comment on that?
Well, there's one comment here, and I mean, I don't know if you want people to be just unmute themselves, but I have just the comment from Marion is, saying she likes the thinking here. I worry about using contemporary pop because the attitudes of the workshop leaders at AP workshops I've sat through. I'm a new AP teacher, and they only seem to respect the canon approved by and selected by leaders of the academy. I don't want to set my students up to be smashed like bugs because of their texts.
I'll tell you what. I teach my kids this way. I teach in a very diverse school. So we have 59 countries represented in my school. We're a major port of entry in Henrietta, New York. I'm always in the upper 80th percentile or low 90 percentile, even when they dropped the qualification rate down to like 52, 53%. I'm always like in the upper 80s, 90s, and we have an open door policy. So good writing is good writing. And I spend more time teaching contemporary poetry than canonical poetry. And then in terms of the whole class text, dude, my kids would kill me if I were to do something like Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre. I mean, they would be bored stiff. I cannot do that stuff with my demographic of kid. It just would not fly. They would totally intellectually disengage, and my kids fare just fine doing our instructional studies.
The other question was from Kristen Bradley saying, you said post-colonialism, what was the other lens?
Reader response. So
That's
ChatGPT does reader response and post-colonial.
Okay.
Yeah. So here's the kicker too. So there's a couple of different ways to do the introduction at the AP level. For my on-level classes, I want them to do it just like what you saw for Taylor Swift. There is a different way to do it, especially if you're using my template of the syllogistic method for the body paragraphs. So I chose a sonnet that I think most of you are probably familiar with. You've probably encountered it, you've heard it. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, which is sonnet 130. So you ask the same question. How do I write the introduction? We're going to invert, right? Answer those questions. What's the authorial intent? How does the author construct meaning? And we're just going to follow the same protocol. 4 sentences, sentence constructs, tier 2, context, background, end with the thesis. But here's the thing. Some teachers say, but Kristian, you're including devices and techniques and terms. I don't do that. Does the College Board require that? The College Board has no clue what it wants half the time, I'm seeing. So I have, worked with readers who, if the terms are not explicitly stated, they're like, there's no thesis. And the College Board is really working hard on this in its current iteration. You don't need to say the terms, the devices, the techniques to have a thesis. But so many of the AP readers are of the persuasion that you do need to explicitly state it, that I've talked to a lot of readers. They're saying that a lot of kids are not getting a thesis point, even though they have a thesis. So I basically go around to my kids in AP and I'm like, you're a strong enough writer. You don't need it. Your thesis just kind of is manifest every time you write. So you don't need the terms. But my struggling emerging students, I'm like, keep them in there just to absolutely make sure you get the thesis point. But there's a way of doing this where you don't have to state the terms. So look at this one here, right? You can just take the terms right out. Giving voice to one's love is just a tricky thing to do given its subjectivity. It's as if words simply cannot convey the magnitude of the feeling. So what we do is resort to comparisons, often to the natural world. Poets have been doing this for centuries while elevating their mistresses to ethereal deities. Shakespeare, on the other hand, brings his girl back to earth and humanizes her while nonetheless expressing his genuine love for her. So it's a big thematic focus, right? And then down in the body paragraphs, you get into the terms and devices in your topic sentences, which I call the first premise. So you can withhold it. In rhetoric, it's called the enthymeme. You can withhold it in mind. It does not need to go in the thesis in a conventional sense. So let me ask you guys in the chat, would you give the next, this one and the next 2 that I'm going to read, would you give them the thesis point? I'll do student number 2 here. When language is rendered ineffable, We often resort to analogies in the hopes that comparisons can get our point across. This is often the case when we try to give voice to love. Love is such an unwieldy thing that it's like counting every grain of sand on a long stretch of beach. But Shakespeare does not go the route of false comparisons. He instead expresses his love plainly. This is something else that I noticed. Do you see how this kid talks about like counting every grain of sand? ChatGPT does not make metaphors, analogies, similes, anything like that. It's very, very robotic. It does not have colorful language. Like some teachers, when they teach introductions, they talk about the hook, the analogy. I could not get ChatGPT to make a hook or an analogy. So that's another way to prevent the cheating. So, and then here's student number 3. When our words fail us, we are reduced to doing things like pantomiming and gesticulating. But poets are craftier than this. They hyperbolize. But instead of being like all of his contemporaries, Shakespeare renders his lover in very grounding and humanistic language. So what do you guys think about these introductions versus the Taylor Swifts and the Frederick Douglasses? Just curious to see what you think. Anything coming in, Jake?
There's some questions that aren't a response to that.
Okay, we'll
But
field those.
although there is a Rachel saying these say something interesting, and I like them because they read less formulaic. Is what something else said, and Lynette said I'd give them the point.
Yeah,
And
I would too. It's just there's some AP readers, they're like, if there ain't a term, I ain't giving it a point, and it's like, College Board's gotta really do some training on that. Really needs to do some clear training on that. Because it's unfortunate. I think I've had kids get ding-donged for not having a thesis because they implied it instead of explicitly stated it.
I mean, and there's always that level of subjectivity in this work that's makes it, a challenge. But there is one question here. There too, Leanne, how do you prepare students for the level of language on the AP Lit exam, reading selections, multiple choice sections, specifically if you're focusing on more contemporary rather than canonical pieces? Of course, there are contemporary pieces where the language will challenge students, but I'm thinking about longer works that have been used for multiple choice passages in the past, like Heart of Darkness, where the language and even the narrative itself is dense. That exposure seems important, but your results are impressive.
Yep. So quick response to that. So my this is kind of how I mathematically break it down. If the text is very hard and I'm going to teach it, it needs to be short. So the longer pieces that I teach tend to be contemporary and easier and more accessible. So my short stories and my poems, they get a whole bunch of canonical stuff through that. My whole class text, like I did The Color Purple this year. I did Metamorphosis. God, what else? The Things They Carry, Handmaid's Tale. Yeah, they would just they would yell at me if I were to give them something like, Wuthering Heights, or I don't know. We tried, my other colleague tried doing Three Musketeers with them. It's just their stamina is not great, so I do better with shorter text with my guys.
Mark has a question. Sorry. Mark
Go
has
ahead.
a question. For recognizing or evaluating ChatGPT writing, isn't the big question how quickly will ChatGPT adapt and evolve? Seems like at 2 months old, it is fairly young. Isn't it possible that within the next 6 months, random time span, the database will grow to address the current limitations, like growth mindset? It can't do it yet.
Yeah, I agree. And let me show you this one right here. This is one where I'm like, all right, Kristian, be the craftiest cheater in your classroom. Look at what I made ChatGPT do for this one. All right. Again, focusing on Sonnet 130. In Sonnet 130, Shakespeare satirizes the typical poetic descriptions of beauty that were popular in his time. In the sonnet, he compares his mistress to various natural and artificial objects, saying that she's not as fair as she is painted and that her eyes are nothing like the sun. Through this comparison, Shakespeare is poking fun at the traditional poetry that idealized and exaggerated the beauty of the beloved. At the same time, however, he also suggests that his mistress is beautiful in her own way, even if she does not conform to conventional standards of beauty. Overall, the tone of the sonnet is one of playful irony, as Shakespeare uses his words to subvert and challenge the conventional expectations of poetry and beauty. So here's the thing. That's sounding like my template quite a bit, right? The chat wrote this. So I had to get those terms in there, right? And I found with older pieces like Shakespeare, we did it with Dickinson, we did it with Whitman just to mess around with it. The chat knows the relevant and germane, the salient terms, devices, techniques. So that actually generated on its own, satirizes the typical poetic descriptions. The chat did that on its own. But one thing I cannot get the chat not to do, especially for writing introductions, it wants to begin to analyze in the introduction. And in my template, there's no analysis happening in the introduction. So you see right here, it's already beginning to quote and analyze. That needs to be withheld for the body paragraphs with my template. So that comes in the second premise. And then the other thing too is I cannot get ChatGPT to write in the present tense. So it's a couple of little, nougats there for you. Really get your kids to focus writing present tense. You get papers that are submitted to you past tense. You probably are like, we really went over this. You're not paying attention, or you plagiarize. If you're using my templates, you definitely don't want to see any analysis in the introduction whatsoever. So I think I had one more. The other little idiosyncrasy of ChatGPT, it loves to begin sentences with yes. I notice it's just a little quirk of ChatGPT. It begins a lot of sentences with yes. So yes, Sonnet 130 by Shakespeare is a tongue-in-cheek poem that satirizes the typical poetic descriptions of beauty that were popular in his time. Through the use of playful irony and comparison, Shakespeare subverts and challenges the conventional expectations of poetry and beauty, suggesting that his mistress is beautiful in her own way, even if she does not conform to conventional standards of beauty. The sonnet is a humorous and unconventional take on the theme of love and beauty, and it remains one of Shakespeare's most popular and enduring works. So this is something else my students don't do. They don't put these little things like it's Shakespeare's most popular and enduring work, right? That doesn't have any part to do whatsoever with an introduction, and ChatGPT loves to throw those little asides in there. Again, written past tense. It is using the terms and devices techniques, and it's a really good read. But here's the thing too, it doesn't make any flaws in the language. There's no hiccups, and we're dealing with 15, 16, 17-year-olds, right? They hiccup when they write often. They have little miscues, miscalculations, missteps. So I think if a student, submits something that's absolutely flawless and polished from start to finish, and you know them to have some tendencies where they misfire and miscalculate, then you probably got a cheater on your hand. So Kristian, I'm at the end. Yeah, go for it, Jake.
Well, there's a couple things, and by the way, I think I know enough of Zoom to say that if people click on the chat, if you want to save the chat, you can save it, and that way there's a link that Rebecca put that this was in today's New York Times. Idea is to teach with it. I haven't opened it yet, but about chat GPT, and I guess people could probably, Kristian, if your call, but like unmute at some point, we could talk about these things. But there was something. I think Frederick Marion says, I think Frederick Douglass manages to communicate clearly, even in the indirect language of his day. I'm not familiar with Taylor Swift lyrics. I think my inner city Title I students are not either. You are inspiring me to start having them work with Kendrick Lamar's lyrics or Chance the Rapper. And I actually, One thing I just wanted to say, because I teach the International Baccalaureate program, and Kendrick Lamar is actually on the list. They just recently put Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Kendrick Lamar. I mean, I guess one is not quite like the other, but in terms of contemporary, they're certainly moving in that direction. So
yeah, and in my YouTube channel, there is a big writing workshop in there. The poetry of hip hop and rap. We did Tupac, Kanye, Biggie, whole look in that YouTube channel. That unit was pretty fat, and my students liked it a lot. And I went old school with like the Last Poets and Tribe Called Quest. A lot of my students didn't know sort of some of the genesis and the origins of that genre, so they were fascinated by the Last Poets and to do a little study in that genre. It's pretty cool stuff.
Gil Scott Heron has I've found to be effective too. If people,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
by the way, so there's a couple things, and then Kristian, if I don't know how you want to do this, but someone asked, I'd like to know what everyone thinks about Turnitin, and there .com, and then there's just a lot coming through now that you may want to take.
Yeah. Well, let me wrap this up, and then we'll just unmute and I'll get rid of my screen here. So in terms of my courses from NWP, we got a cool one coming up beginning January 29th. We open the enrollment doors for that. It's called the Teach It Right 5-week Mastermind. So if you want to take a deeper dive into any of the stuff that we did tonight, in that course, we have a thorough deep dive into my Word Study Academy, the Nuance Academy, my templates across the expository modes, my alternative grading methods, my Plato's Plato discussion, which is this alternative discussion modality that sort of runs counter to Socratic seminars and Harkness discussions, fish bowls. So I find those don't really work too terribly well for my demographic. So that begins January 29th. And in terms of getting in touch with me, there's also a self-paced course if people don't want to do a live course with me. NWP and I literally just finished putting together a self-paced course, which is pretty cool. And you get 10 completion hours, PD completion hours for both of those courses. And then in keeping in touch with me, or if you have any comments, concerns, or want anything, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com is the best email address. And then all of my NWP stuff, and I got a lot of free like content on my webpage, teachinghowtowrite.com is my personal website. Yeah, if anyone wants to unmute and have at it, that's cool. Let's do that. I'll get rid of my slides here. So anyone have anything burning to say or want to contribute? You can unmute yourself, and I'll do my best to field whatever comes my way. So this one, Leanne had, may I ask what you are doing, Kristian, to tackle plagiarism when it comes to ChatGPT? It's hard to address without hard proof. My students have to adhere to the strictures of my template. If they don't, I don't accept it. And the ChatGPT cannot write like me. When they go to these paid sources and have college kids write their essays for them, they don't use my templates. So I just say it has to be in the stricture of my template. When you become a really good writer and no longer need my training wheels or my scaffolds, we can kick them off. But that's something that we'll discuss during a writing workshop. So kids ultimately graduate from my templates. They don't need them after a while. They got the alacrity and the pizzazz to do it on their own. Anything else?
This is Rebecca. Kelly asked a very pertinent question about professional development and ideas on how to use this in a positive way. And I'm looking forward to your answer as well.
So to use ChatGPT in a positive way?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. My students and I were talking about that. You know, one of my students says, I don't think this is an all or nothing proposition, Mr. Kuhn. It's not, you know, this nemesis that is antithetical to all things ELA. And I'm like, I know. We're going to have to figure out ways to use this to our advantage to lessen the load and really um I don't know, make it work for us somehow and befriend it somehow. I haven't thunked up any ways. Anyone that's remaining in the peanut gallery have any like constructive uses for it?
Well, I've been teaching long enough to have a former student who was an English teacher, and he's been teaching about 7 years. And he made the suggestion that if ChatGPT can write it, then maybe we should have ChatGPT grade them all too.
Yeah, love it. Love it.
Well, what do you think about starting with a chat GPT that they then have to revise? Many of my college students want to do one and done and they don't ever want to see it again. So that's an issue that I struggle with.
Hmm. That's probably a good idea. I like the sounds of that. Very good.
Kristian, you did say that your school has shut it down as a resource that students can go
It's a
to.
block site. Yep. So my understanding is that you can access it. But one of our librarians said this to me. I use 3 different ones that I experimented with. I don't know if there's more than those 3. I honestly don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
There's a question here about where your templates could be purchased.
Well, they're kind of in the sky. You know, I think when people refer to templates, they want something like handwritten down. They're theoretical conceptual templates that I literally just model that template over and over again until it becomes the kids. So I don't really have anything to sell for them. I do have a lot of writing workshops that I've created that are in YouTube that just I basically Bob Ross how to do the intros and the bodies, and they're examples that I wrote. So it's just one of those pattern repetitive things where kids see it over and over and over again, and then they just begin to do it on their own. I know some teachers that have templates use a lot of stems and lead-in sentences and things of that. I find that to be a little too paint by number. I want this to be organic and supple and genuinely the kids' own work. So I don't try to, I don't know, I just don't want to be that confining with kids unless they really absolutely need sentence stems.
To clarify though, you do like you say an introduction should be 4 sentences.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you do have some hard, fast rules.
Yeah. Like exactly what we went over. Yeah. I mean, I have I don't know, NWP, and I probably should talk about that, like making some posters and things like that. I have them for my own classroom, but I haven't sold any of that stuff. Probably should. Anything else?
Can I'm sorry to keep talking, but I'm just interested. I imagine I'm hoping other people will chime in, but I'm interested in your thoughts about vocabulary. I think a lot of us as teachers feel like, you know, there's always this idea that vocabulary is best taught in context, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I do adhere to a lot of that. I'm teaching The Great Gatsby right now, and it's a challenging book, but I've given us some opportunities to look at, you know, the vocab beforehand, so they have some awareness of it as they're going into it. So that's the context we're teaching it in. But I guess I'm just wondering, like, what's your you called it your vocabulary academy?
Yep, the Word Study Academy. So I agree. All my vocab is done on a contextualized basis. So vocab is really tough to learn in isolation, just doing word definition. There's actually a lot of cognitive science saying that it's really antithetical. Kids don't learn. The Velcro is use the word in context 3 times and it sticks to your brain. And so I do something called word slams. and I do a lot of gamification and like edutainment things with my students. Like, for example, today, I have this belief that kids know far more words than they think they know, just by being in existence for 15 or 16 years. So we played probably just like the first 5-6 minutes of class, and I'm on a block schedule, so 86 minutes. Our vocab exercise was this: we're playing a game of Family Feud over 5 blocks. Just like quick 6 minutes, 7-minute intervals. And I would, split the class into 2 teams, just like Family Feud. 2 kids come up to the center table and they have the little slap button things. And I would give them a sentence like this: Florence's performance, let me get, in spite of 3 months of dreadful performance, Florence had the blank to ask for a pay raise. And they have to slap it, the first tier 2 level word that comes to mind. And the kids were like, audacity, moxie, gumption, gall. And I'm like, yes. So Ava took off her soiled sock, and the stench was so repugnant, putrid, rank, foul. They have all these words in their head, and by hearing other kids use these words, the students just kind of gradually sponge them. But I do a lot of real concentrated, focused word study too, in addition to things like that. So we do pretty much a word study exercise every day in my class. Yeah, so you can see in some of those writing samples, my kids got some chops with their words. Big vocabs. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off because my cat is hitting its bowl wanting dinner. I forgot to feed it before the webinar. Cooper's being very patient with me. He's like batting the hell out of his bowl, like, you forgot about me. So thank you all for coming. Yep.
Will you be sending us a follow-up email with the link to the recording?
Yeah, I'll do that. Yep. Okay, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Jake, I appreciate you so much for playing moderator tonight.
Thank you. I tried to get to what I saw.